The helicopter fell from the sky, and Mexico City went silent. They thought it was an accident, mechanical failure, bad weather, human error. But investigators knew better, because 3 days earlier, a message had been delivered. A warning from a man who doesn't repeat himself. The government had made a decision, a calculated strike against Jalisco. They believed they could pressure him, corner him, force a mistake. But they underestimated something critical. El Mencho doesn't react. He responds. And when he does, the cost is measured in silence. Not gunfire, not explosions, just absence. People who were there one day simply weren't the next. Officials who signed orders found themselves alone, isolated, exposed. This wasn't a war. This was a lesson, and the government refused to learn it. What happened next didn't just shake a nation. It rewrote the rules. The file satisfied 200 pages. Intelligence reports, surveillance photographs, intercepted communications, witness testimonies from sources who would never live to repeat their words in court. It sat on a mahogany desk in Mexico City, and the man behind that desk believed he was looking at an opportunity. According to investigators and journalists who later reconstructed this period, a high-ranking government official had grown impatient. The pressure from international partners was mounting. The Americans wanted results. The media wanted arrests. The public wanted someone to blame for the violence spreading across western Mexico like a quiet fire. And every thread led back to one name: Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes. El Mencho. The official studied the photographs. A grainy image of a ranch in the highlands of Jalisco. Satellite imagery showing vehicle patterns. Thermal signatures suggesting regular activity at unusual hours. His advisors told him what he wanted to hear. He's exposed. His inner circle is fracturing. We have assets in position. This is the moment. The official nodded slowly. He didn't ask questions. He didn't request alternative assessments. He didn't consider what would happen if the intelligence was wrong. Or worse, what would happen if it was right? Because capturing El Mencho was one thing. Surviving his response was another. The operation was authorized on a Tuesday. Quiet, classified, compartmentalized so tightly that even some military commanders didn't know the full scope until hours before deployment. 3 coordinated strikes. Air support, ground teams, federal agents working alongside military special forces. The goal was simple on paper: decapitate CJNG leadership, capture or eliminate El Mencho, demonstrate that no one, no matter how powerful, was beyond the government's reach. But paper doesn't bleed. Paper doesn't remember. And paper doesn't warn you when you've just made the worst decision of your career. What the official didn't understand, what perhaps he couldn't understand, was that El Mencho had spent 2 decades preparing for exactly this moment. He wasn't a man who built an empire on luck. He built it on anticipation. Every government contact had a shadow. Every military frequency had an ear. Every official who thought they were hunting him was already being watched. Reports suggest that within hours of the operation's authorization, El Mencho knew. Not the details, not the timing, but the intention. And intention was enough. He didn't panic. Panic is for men who don't control their environment. Instead, according to sources who later spoke to investigators, he simply asked one question. Who signed it? A name was provided. He nodded once. Then he said nothing else for 3 days. In the silence of those 3 days, something shifted. Government informants stopped reporting. Scheduled meetings were missed. Safe houses that had been active for months suddenly went dark. The intelligence community noticed. but they interpreted it wrong. They thought CJNG was scrambling, disorganized, afraid. They thought the pressure was working. They didn't realize they were watching something else entirely. Preparation, not for defense, for demonstration. The official in Mexico City received updates throughout those 3 days. The operation is proceeding as planned. Assets are in position. No significant resistance detected. He smiled at that last report. No significant resistance. He took it as validation. Proof that El Mencho was weaker than his legend suggested. Proof that the government could project force and the cartels would bend. He didn't understand what investigators would later piece together. El Mencho wasn't resisting because he didn't need to. Resistance implies fear. And El Mencho wasn't afraid. He was calculating, measuring the distance between action and consequence, deciding exactly how much the government would pay. The strikes launched on a Friday morning. Helicopters, ground vehicles, coordinated timing across 3 locations in Jalisco. The teams moved with precision. And they found nothing. Empty ranches, abandoned vehicles. Cold trails that led nowhere. Every location had been evacuated at least 48 hours before. The operation wasn't a failure. It was a message. We knew you were coming. We let you come. And now you've committed yourself. The official received the reports that evening. His advisors scrambled for explanations. Leaked intelligence. Compromised sources. Bad timing. But the official wasn't listening anymore. He was staring at his phone. A text message from an unknown number. 3 words. No threat. No demand. No signature. Just 3 words that investigators would later describe as the beginning of everything that followed. You were warned. If you're still here, watching this unfold, take a moment. Hit that subscribe button. Drop a like. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Because this story doesn't stop. And neither does he. The official didn't sleep that night. He made calls. Demanded security assessments. Requested additional protection for his family, his staff, his residents. But here's what he didn't understand. El Mencho's power wasn't about violence. It was about inevitability. He didn't need to send armed men. He didn't need to breach security. He just needed to wait. Because when you've built an empire on consequences, real, measured, inescapable consequences, you don't need to chase your enemies. They come to you, or they disappear. Either way, the outcome is the same. 3 days later, a helicopter fell from the sky, and the official finally understood. He hadn't launched an operation. He'd triggered a response. And El Mencho's responses are never proportional. They're educational. The first sign came not with violence, but with silence. According to investigators who later reconstructed the timeline, it began 72 hours before the helicopter incident. A federal intelligence officer stationed in Guadalajara missed his scheduled check-in. Not unusual. Field operatives sometimes go dark for operational security. Protocol allowed a 24-hour window before escalation. But then a second officer missed his check-in. Then a third. By the end of the first day, 7 assets embedded in Jalisco had gone completely silent. No distress signals. No emergency protocols activated. No bodies discovered. Just absence. The Intelligence Directorate in Mexico City flagged it as a potential compromise. Standard procedure. Assume the worst. Pull back peripheral operations. Reassess source reliability. But one analyst noticed something the others missed. The silent operatives weren't random. They were all connected to the same intelligence thread. The operation against El Mencho. Every single one had contributed to the file sitting on that official's desk. Every single one had helped build the case. And now every single one had vanished. Reports suggest that the analyst raised concerns to his supervisor. The response was dismissive. Coincidence. Operational stress. They'll resurface. But they didn't resurface. Not that week. Not that month. Not ever. Some were later found alive, relocated to distant states, refusing to speak to federal authorities. Their families quietly moved to undisclosed locations. Others simply ceased to exist in any official record. No death certificates. No missing persons reports. No trace. Mencho hadn't eliminated them. He'd erased them, made them understand that their continued existence depended entirely on their silence. And silence they provided. The second sign came through channels no one expected. A state prosecutor in Jalisco received a phone call. Unknown number. Blocked origin. Voice digitally altered. The message was brief. Tell your friends in the capital. The next move is theirs. But so is the next consequence. The prosecutor reported the call immediately. It was logged, analyzed, traced to a disposable phone purchased in cache 300 kilometers away. Dead end. But the message itself was clear. Mencho wasn't hiding. He wasn't running. He was communicating. What made this different from typical cartel intimidation was the precision. No public threats. No viral videos. No gruesome displays meant to terrorize civilians. This was targeted, controlled, almost professional. Investigators later noted that Mencho's communication style reflected his background. Former law enforcement, military training, years spent understanding how institutions function and how they fail. He knew that public spectacles invite public responses. But private warnings create private fear. And private fear spreads. The official in Mexico City received his own message 3 days before the helicopter fell. Not a phone call. Not a text. Something far more unsettling. According to sources who spoke to journalists years later, a manila envelope appeared on his desk. No postmark. No return address. No indication of how it bypassed multiple security checkpoints. Inside was a single photograph. The official's daughter, 17 years old, walking to school. Timestamped that morning. No threat attached. No demand. No instructions. Just the photograph. And the implicit understanding of what it meant. We are closer than you think. We can reach what you love. And we are choosing not to. For now. The official's hands trembled as he stared at the image. This wasn't intimidation. This was demonstration. Mencho was showing him the difference between capability and action. He could have done something unthinkable. He chose not to. And that choice was the warning. A warning that said, the next choice might be different. What happened in the following hours revealed everything about how power operates in Mexico. The official didn't cancel the operation. He didn't report the envelope through proper channels. He didn't reassess the risk calculation. Instead, he made a different decision. He accelerated the timeline. Reports suggest he believed speed would provide protection. That striking fast would catch Mencho off balance. That demonstrating resolve would deter further escalation. He was wrong on every count. Mencho anticipated the acceleration. According to investigators, CJNG had contingencies for exactly this scenario. The moment the operation timeline shifted, assets on the ground activated protocols that had been dormant for months. Safe houses were evacuated within hours. Key personnel relocated to secondary positions. Communication networks switched to backup frequencies. By the time federal forces launched their coordinated strikes, they were raiding ghosts. Empty buildings. Cold coffee cups. Silence. But the most chilling detail came later. When forensic teams swept the abandoned locations, they found something unusual. In each location, every single one, a small object had been left behind. A chess piece. A black king. Positioned precisely in the center of the main room. No fingerprints. No DNA. No trace evidence. Just the piece. And its message. You moved. I was already ahead. Your king is exposed. Check. The official learned about the chess pieces that evening. According to sources, he sat alone in his office for 2 hours. No calls. No meetings. No communication. Just silence. Processing what he had done. And what was coming. Because Mencho's warnings were never empty. They were announcements. Declarations of intent delivered with enough lead time to establish a clear chain of cause and effect. You acted. You were warned. You proceeded anyway. Therefore, what follows is your responsibility. This was the logic of consequences. And consequences in Mencho's world are absolute. The government had 72 hours of warnings. Silent assets. Direct messages. Photographs demonstrating reach. Chess pieces declaring intellectual superiority. 72 hours to reconsider. To de-escalate. To recognize that they were not dealing with a common criminal, but with a strategic mind that had survived and thrived for decades against impossible odds. They didn't listen. They didn't learn. And so the sky fell. Investigators would later describe this period as a masterclass in psychological warfare. Mencho never raised his voice. Never issued public ultimatums. Never gave the media anything to sensationalize. He simply demonstrated capability, showed reach, and waited for his enemies to make the choice that justified his response. They always made that choice. They always justified his response. And that's what made him different. He didn't need to be the aggressor. He just needed to be inevitable. 72 hours after the first warning, a military helicopter fell from the sky. The government called it a tragedy. Mencho called it nothing. He didn't need to. Everyone already understood. The morning was clear. No clouds. No wind. Perfect visibility across the Jalisco highlands. Ideal conditions for flight. And yet, according to official reports, the military helicopter designated as Black Hawk 102 lifted off at 7:42 a.m. from a secured federal installation. 8 souls on board. Experienced crew. Decorated officers. Men who had flown dozens of similar missions without incident. Their objective that morning was classified as routine reconnaissance, surveying terrain in a region suspected of CJNG activity. At 8:17 a.m., radar contact was lost. At 8:23 a.m., local emergency services received the first reports. Smoke rising from a hillside. Wreckage scattered across 300 meters of terrain. No survivors. The government's initial statement called it an accident. Mechanical failure. Possible engine malfunction. An investigation would be launched to determine the precise cause. Standard language. Controlled messaging. Nothing to suggest anything other than tragedy. But within hours, whispers began circulating through intelligence channels. Whispers that told a different story. Investigators who examined the wreckage faced immediate anomalies. The damage pattern was inconsistent with simple mechanical failure. Engine components that should have shown gradual degradation appeared to have failed catastrophically and simultaneously. The flight data recorder, when recovered, showed no warning indicators. No pilot distress calls. No emergency maneuvers. No attempt at auto-rotation. One moment, the helicopter was flying normally. The next, it was falling. The official investigation would eventually conclude undetermined technical factors. But those who understood cartel capabilities knew what that language really meant. It meant they couldn't prove what they suspected. And what they suspected was unprecedented. Reports from sources who spoke to journalists years later painted a disturbing picture. In the months preceding the incident, CJNG had reportedly acquired sophisticated anti-aircraft capabilities. Not through conventional arms dealers, through networks that stretched across continents. Weapons that were never supposed to reach criminal organizations. Weapons that could reach the sky. Mencho understood something fundamental about power. Governments maintain authority through monopoly on force. They control the ground. They control the air. They control the perception of invincibility. Break that monopoly, even once, and everything changes. Not because you've defeated them militarily, but because you've defeated them psychologically. You've demonstrated that their height advantage means nothing, that their machines can fall, that their people can die, and that you, the one they're hunting, can make it happen. The 8 men who perished that morning were not Mencho's enemies. They were soldiers following orders, professionals doing their duty. Their families would mourn them as heroes. And investigators would later describe this as the terrible mathematics of cartel warfare, where the cost of government decisions is paid by those who didn't make them. Mencho didn't target those 8 men because he hated them. He targeted them because they were visible, because their deaths would be undeniable, because a helicopter falling from the sky is not something that can be hidden, explained away, or forgotten. It is a statement written in wreckage. And the statement was simple. You sent men to find me. I sent them back. Reconsider. The official in Mexico City learned of the crash within an hour. According to sources, he was in a meeting when an aide interrupted. The color drained from his face as he read the preliminary report. 8 dead. Helicopter destroyed. Cause undetermined. But in his mind, the cause was perfectly clear. He saw the photograph of his daughter. He remembered the text message. You were warned. And now he understood what that warning meant. What followed in the next 48 hours revealed the true impact of Mencho's response. Military operations in Jalisco were quietly suspended. Not canceled officially. That would require admitting defeat. Simply postponed, reassessed, subjected to additional strategic review. Federal agents stationed in the region requested transfers. Some cited family concerns. Others claimed health issues. A few didn't bother with explanations at all. They simply left. The Intelligence Directorate conducted an internal assessment. Classified. Eyes only. Never meant for public consumption. According to sources who later leaked portions to journalists, the assessment reached a disturbing conclusion. CJNG's defensive capabilities had evolved beyond what any criminal organization had previously demonstrated. They weren't just a cartel anymore. They were a parallel military force, with discipline, with equipment, with strategic thinking that rivaled state actors. And at the center of it all, the architect of this transformation, sat Mencho. Watching this unfold, you begin to understand something. This isn't just a story about crime. It's about strategy. It's about a man who studied his enemies for decades and learned exactly where they were vulnerable. Take a moment. Subscribe. Tell me in the comments what country you're watching from and what time it is there. Because what happens next changes everything. The government faced a choice in the days following the helicopter's fall. Escalate or retreat. Double down or reassess. Pride or pragmatism. According to investigators, different factions within the administration advocated for different approaches. Hawks demanded overwhelming force. Flood Jalisco with troops. demonstrate that such attacks would not be tolerated. Doves counseled caution. The intelligence was compromised. The enemy had demonstrated unexpected capabilities. Further escalation risked further losses. The debate raged behind closed doors. But while they debated, Mencho acted. Because he understood something else about power. The moment your enemy hesitates is not the moment to pause. It's the moment to press. Not through more violence. Through presence. Through demonstrating that while they argued, he expanded. While they mourned, he consolidated. While they questioned their strategies, he executed his. In the 2 weeks following the helicopter incident, CJNG reportedly established control over 3 additional municipalities in Jalisco. No major firefights. No dramatic confrontations. Just quiet absorption. Local officials who had aligned with the government suddenly found themselves without support. Promises of federal protection evaporated. Resources dried up. And into that vacuum stepped Mencho's organization, offering what the government couldn't: stability, order, consequences for those who disrupted either. The helicopter didn't just fall from the sky. It took something with it. Confidence. The government's confidence that they could project force without cost. The military's confidence that they controlled the airspace. The public's confidence that someone somewhere was winning this war. All of it falling with the wreckage, scattering across 300 meters of hillside, never to be fully reassembled. And Mencho, he said nothing, issued no statements, claimed no responsibility, made no boasts. He didn't need to. The silence said everything. Because when you've made your point, when your enemies understand exactly what you're capable of, words become unnecessary. Actions speak. Consequences echo. And silence confirms. The sky had fallen. And with it, the illusion that this was a war the government could win through force alone. They needed a new strategy. But finding one would require acknowledging something they weren't ready to admit. That the man they were hunting wasn't just ahead of them. He was operating on an entirely different level. The first resignation came quietly. No press conference. No official statement. No explanation offered to colleagues or subordinates. A deputy security director in Jalisco simply left. Cleared his desk on a Tuesday afternoon. Drove home. Never returned. His family relocated within the week. No forwarding address. According to investigators who later mapped the pattern, he was the first of 17. 17 officials, federal, state, and municipal, who had direct connection to the operation against Mencho. 17 men who had signed documents, authorized resources, or provided intelligence. 17 men who stopped answering their phones. Some resigned citing health concerns. Others claimed family emergencies. A few simply vanished, abandoning positions, pensions, entire careers built over decades. No violence required. No threats documented. Just departure. Mencho understood bureaucracy. He understood that governments don't function through leaders alone. They function through systems. Networks. Mid-level officials who keep machinery running. Remove those officials, make them afraid, make them disappear, and the machinery grinds to a halt. You don't need to defeat an army. You need to convince the army that fighting isn't worth the cost. The official in Mexico City watched his support structure crumble. Allies stopped returning calls. Meetings were canceled without explanation. Intelligence reports arrived late, then incomplete, then not at all. He was being isolated. Not through assassination. Through abandonment. Reports suggest he requested a security review. The assessment returned classified findings. His inner circle had been compromised, not by infiltration but by fear. People who once stood beside him now calculated distance, because proximity to him meant proximity to consequence. And no one wanted to be close when consequence arrived. This was El Mencho's method. He didn't eliminate enemies. He made them irrelevant, stripped away their support, severed their connections, left them standing alone in offices that once held power. And then he waited, because isolated men make desperate decisions, and desperate decisions create opportunities. While Mexico City scrambled for answers, Jalisco grew quiet. Not the quiet of peace, the quiet of consolidation. According to investigators and journalists who tracked cartel movements during this period, CJNG expanded its territorial control with surgical precision. No dramatic invasions, no prolonged firefights, no headlines, just steady, methodical absorption. Small towns along strategic corridors woke up to new realities. The police chief who had resisted cartel influence suddenly retired. The mayor who had cooperated with federal authorities found himself without allies. Local businesses that had refused to pay tribute discovered their supply chains mysteriously disrupted. And then, just as mysteriously, those disruptions ended. Once arrangements were made. Once loyalty was demonstrated. Once everyone understood who actually controlled their future. El Mencho didn't conquer territory. He administered it. There's a difference. Conquerors inspire resistance. Administrators inspire dependence. Reports from this period describe something unusual. In areas newly absorbed by CJNG, violence actually decreased. Street crime dropped. Robberies declined. Petty disputes were resolved quickly and permanently. Not because El Mencho cared about public safety, but because chaos is bad for business, and his business required order. The government's operation had been designed to destabilize CJNG. Instead, it achieved the opposite. By forcing El Mencho to demonstrate his capabilities, by pushing him to respond, they had inadvertently showcased his power to every potential rival, every wavering ally, every community weighing its options. The helicopter's fall wasn't just a message to Mexico City. It was an advertisement to everyone else. This is what we can do. This is what opposing us costs. Choose wisely. Rival organizations took notice. According to intelligence assessments, competing cartels quietly adjusted their strategies. Territories they had contested for years were suddenly abandoned. Routes they had fought to control were ceded without resistance. Not because they were defeated, because they were calculating. And the calculation was clear. Confronting CJNG now, after what had happened, was suicide. Better to wait. Better to watch. Better to let the government absorb the consequences of its own decisions. El Mencho used this window masterfully. While his enemies hesitated, he moved. New alliances formed with organizations across Central America. Distribution networks expanded into previously contested markets. Financial infrastructure, legitimate businesses, shell companies, investment vehicles, grew more sophisticated. The empire wasn't just surviving. It was evolving. Investigators would later describe this period as CJNG's transformation. From cartel to conglomerate. From criminal organization to parallel state. With its own taxation systems. Its own justice mechanisms. Its own social services in communities the government had abandoned. El Mencho wasn't building a gang. He was building a nation within a nation. And every government mistake accelerated the construction. The official in Mexico City received reports of this expansion. Each briefing more alarming than the last. Each map showing CJNG influence spreading like water finding cracks. He had launched an operation to weaken El Mencho. He had strengthened him instead. This is the paradox of fighting power with force. Force creates martyrs. Force creates motivation. Force creates the very conditions that allow empires to grow. Mencho understood this. The government did not. By the time the helicopter wreckage had been cleared and the investigations concluded, CJNG controlled more territory than before the operation began. More routes, more officials, more fear. The government hadn't contained the threat. They had fed it. And somewhere in the highlands of Jalisco, according to sources who would never speak publicly, Mencho reviewed the expansion reports with quiet satisfaction. Not celebration, satisfaction. Because this was never about ego. It was about mathematics, action and reaction, investment and return. He had invested a response. The return exceeded projections. The empire had adjusted, and the adjustment was permanent. Months passed. The headlines faded. The investigations concluded with carefully worded ambiguity. The official in Mexico City was quietly reassigned to a position of no consequence. No scandal, no prosecution, no public acknowledgement of failure. Just reassignment. The government's way of admitting defeat without speaking the words. But the lesson remained, burned into the memory of every official who had witnessed the sequence. Warning, action, consequence, expansion, a perfect cycle, a perfect demonstration of what happens when you move against a man who has already anticipated your move. According to investigators who later studied CJNG's evolution, the helicopter incident became a reference point. Not discussed openly, but understood implicitly. Whenever a new operation was proposed against Mencho, someone in the room would remember. Someone would hesitate. Someone would ask the question no one wanted to answer. What happens after? What is the cost of success, if we even achieve it? And what is the cost of failure? The government didn't stop pursuing Mencho. They couldn't. The pressure, international, political, public, demanded action. But the nature of that pursuit changed. Less direct, less aggressive, less confident. Operations became smaller, more targeted, designed to demonstrate activity rather than achieve results. Symbolic gestures meant to satisfy observers without provoking response. Because provoking response had proven catastrophic. This was Mencho's ultimate victory. Not territory, not wealth, not even survival. Deterrence. He had achieved what nations spend billions trying to achieve. The ability to prevent attack through the credible promise of unacceptable consequences. And he had done it not through overwhelming force, but through calculated precision. 1 helicopter, 8 lives, 17 resignations, 3 months of expansion. The mathematics were elegant. Minimal investment, maximum return. A lesson taught once, remembered forever. The official who had authorized the original operation never spoke publicly about what happened. According to sources close to him, he aged visibly in the months following. Stopped attending social functions. Withdrew from political circles. Became a ghost haunting the margins of a system he once believed he controlled. Some said he feared for his life. Others said he feared something worse. The knowledge that he had been outmaneuvered completely. That every decision he made had been anticipated. That he had never been the hunter. Only the hunted, allowed to believe otherwise until the trap closed. Mencho didn't need to harm him. The man had harmed himself. Destroyed his own career through arrogance. Dismantled his own legacy through miscalculation. Mencho simply provided the conditions. The official did the rest. This is the nature of true power. Not forcing outcomes. Creating environments where outcomes become inevitable. Where enemies defeat themselves. where consequences flow naturally from decisions made under pressure. El Mencho didn't fight the government. He let the government fight itself. Years later, journalists would ask sources close to CJNG about this period. About the helicopter. About the warnings. About the expansion that followed. The answers were always the same. Vague acknowledgement. Careful deflection. Neither confirmation nor denial. But one phrase appeared repeatedly. Spoken quietly. Almost reverently. He doesn't repeat lessons. That was the warning encoded in everything that happened. El Mencho teaches once. Once is enough. If you don't learn, if you force him to teach again, the curriculum changes. The cost increases. The consequences multiply. The government learned. Rivals learned. The international community learned. And El Mencho continued. Building. Expanding. Consolidating. Not because he was violent. Because he was inevitable. Today, CJNG operates across multiple continents. Its networks span dozens of countries. Its influence reaches places most people would never suspect. And at the center, still unseen, still uncaptured, still calculating, sits the man who turned a government operation into an empire-building opportunity. Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes. El Mencho. The man who warned them. The man they refused to hear. The man who made them listen. Some stories end with capture. Some end with death. This one doesn't end at all. Because the empire still stands. The lesson still echoes. And the warning, delivered years ago through silence, through absence, through a helicopter falling from a clear morning sky, still applies. Move against me if you choose. But understand the cost before you decide. Because I don't make threats. I make promises. And my promises are kept. The screen fades. But the story continues. Somewhere in Mexico. Somewhere beyond reach. Somewhere between myth and reality. El Mencho remains. Watching. Waiting. Calculating the next lesson. For those foolish enough to require one.